Hey, can everybody hear me? A little bit loud. Hey folks, welcome. Thanks for coming tonight. My name is Jerry Cimino, for those of you I've never met. And my wife and I founded the Beat Museum back in 2003. And so we've been around for over 20 years, brought it to San Francisco in 2006. I think this is the first crowd I've addressed here since we made our most recent announcement, which is a new museum. It's going to be located literally at the intersection of Haight and Ashbury, and it's called the Counterculture Museum. And we're going to focus on not only the Beat generation and how they became the beatniks and how the beatniks became the hippies in the 60s, but we're also going to talk about civil rights and LGBTQ and feminism or women's roles, changing roles of women, and really encapsulate that whole modern counterculture that many of us are aware of, and especially people who really study the beats know how the beats were in the middle of everything that happened in the 60s, etc. So we're really excited about that. And that makes tonight's guest right in our alley, because she's just a magnificent writer. She's done many, many books. She's edited books, she's written books, she's been published all over the world. And I first learned of Holly when she edited this book called The Rolling Stones Book of the Beats. And this came out, I think it was 1999. And a good friend of mine by the name of Brian Hassett is a mutual friend with Holly. And so he introduced us not too long ago. And it was really like a coming home, because when you love the same stuff, you start talking immediately and you're just jabbering all over the place. And then Holly, on the Haight-Ashbury side, is the author of Janis. So we're very thrilled to be able to have you here tonight, Holly. We're honored, actually. And to be able to welcome you folks to the Beat Museum if you've never been here, to be able to tell you about the new Counterculture Museum. We're looking for volunteers if anybody wants to help us paint and do other things. You can find us at counterculturemuseum.org, and that'll be opening in 2025. So without any further ado, we're going to have people coming in as we speak. If you hear us moving things around to make room for people, please try not to let that distract you. And please give me, or join me in welcoming with a warm round of applause, Holly George.
Hello, thank you, Jerry, for that great intro, and thanks so much, Brandon. This great place that we're all gathered together here. I'm so excited to be here, and especially on the 5th anniversary of the publication of Janis for Life and Music. I was planning to come, I got to be here in town in 2019 when the book was published in hardcover. I was planning to come back for the paperback softcover edition, but guess what? Something happened. I won't go into that, but you guys know what I'm talking about. So this is my first time back to San Francisco since the book came out in 2019. So thrilled to be back here. And on the 25th anniversary of the Rolling Stone Book of the Beats, which Jerry referenced, which was just, I ran the book division at Rolling Stone from 1993 to 2001. And I did 40-some books while I was there, with put together a team of other worker bees, writers, photographers, many, many people to do these projects. But of all of them, the Rolling Stone Book of the Beats was my absolute favorite. And I'm so still being remembered. And I got to meet amazing, incredible people working on that book. I got to meet Carolyn Cassidy, many people who are here in this museum. Carolyn Cassidy, Hetty Jones, Joyce Johnson, Ann Charters, who wrote the first biography of Jack Kerouac that I read as a teenager growing up in North Carolina back in the 70s, right after I read On the Road at 16 years old. So I was very happy to get to meet all those people. And then the great David Amram, who I just loved to pieces, who is turning 94 a week from today. And I was just with New York, where he was playing a gig, telling stories. I mean, the guy's, if I have half of his energy, like next week I'll be happy, you know? He's just amazing. In fact, I just got a really great email from him today saying to give his best to Jerry and Estelle and everybody here at the Beat Museum. He loves this place, and he's like, yeah, I got in at 2 a.m. last night from playing a gig at the Brooklyn Book Festival down in the city. You know, we live about 3 hours upstate New York from New York City, so that book opened the door to my longtime friendship with David Amram, and many other people. And now, working on my Jack Kerouac biography, I've gotten to meet some great people like Charlie Shuttleworth, who is here. Welcome him. He's done lots of extensive research and on Kerouac and has put together some amazing collections, which he's edited and written about. I believe at least one of them is here, maybe two. It's got a brand new one coming out. Is it officially out, or the second one, Charles? Or?
Well, self-portrait, they don't have any copies today.
Okay.
There's
So it's
one of Desolation Peak, and the Buddhist Tears comes out in February.
okay. That's it. So soon there'll be 3. So recommend those books for some Kerouac that you may have not read, and Charles' take on Kerouac, which has been really helpful to me, and working for the past few years and still in research mode in the Kerouac world. But interestingly enough, of course, I discovered, weirdly, I discovered Jack Kerouac and Janis Joplin around the same time back in the 70s. And there are some strange similarities between them, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. But the interesting thing is when my Janis book came out, one of the people that read the book and liked it and noticed, wow, I never realized how much Janis was really inspired by Kerouac and the Beats, even before she discovered Leadbelly and Bessie Smith, some of the musicians who really inspired her to switch from her career goal of being a painter, kind of a female Modigliani, to a singer, was reading on the road, really kind of took her. I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. I thought what I would do is read a little excerpt from an essay I wrote a while ago that kind of seems to have a lot of relevance where we are right now this week. But in the meantime, Jim Sampas, who is the literary executor of the Kerouac estate, read in my book, Janis, about the effect of Kerouac, and I guess he liked the way I wrote, whatever, so reached out to me during the pandemic and said, hey, we're looking for someone to share all this amazing writings of Kerouac with and, work with as far as giving permission to quote whatever we own the copyright to do a new biography with kind of a new take on Kerouac, and would you be interested? And so I'm like, well, sure. And fortunately, I have a track record of having worked with some other estates. I have a literary agent who's very good at these collaboration agreements, so I worked with Janis's siblings for this book, and then my first biography of Gene Autry, some of you may remember in On the Road, writes that Dean Moriarty looks like a young Gene Autry. So my first biography that came out, it was in 2007, I worked with his estate as well, and what I have to make sure is that the estate is cool with the fact that they're going to give me access to all this great stuff, but they can't tell me what to write. I have to have complete autonomy over what I write in that book, and so luckily people have said yes, and that's the case with Jim Sampas. So it's been a great journey from Janis to Jack, and we'll see what happens. I'm still in the research mode on my Jack Kerouac book. I have a way to go before I can just put it all together and start putting it down on paper. I wish I could be like Jack and write it in 3 days, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be more like the real Jack, who actually did many versions and drafts, various kind of path to On the Road that we know and love, but many previous versions of some of the characters, some of the ideas that took quite a few years to get to that point. So, hey, just saying. But anyway, so yeah, I would read a bit from this essay I wrote called Light is Faster Than Sound, Texans, the Beats, and the San Francisco Counterculture. And it really kind of, as Jerry was telling you, there's such a connection between the Beats and the counterculture. Many of you probably are aware of that, but now he's going to have this very cool new museum that's going to emphasize those ties. And then of course, there's some parts of the museum here where you see those ties as well. And we have one of the people here that is actually name-checked in my piece, so I will mention him in a minute. But you'll see how people living in a very, well, let's put it this way, very repressive, difficult place, they're able to kind of rise above these hard times that they're living in to use their creativity and their freedom of expression elsewhere to do new, exciting, important things. And that's what you'll see that Janis Joplin did. So some of us might be upset about what happened on Tuesday. I know. And I hope that this will give you a little bit of a little lift of spirits to think about how we can sometimes rise above difficult times. Okay? So, also just to mention, this was originally published in a book. I don't know if Jerry has a copy of it here. It is called Kerouac on Record, a Literary Soundtrack. It was published back in 2018 by Bloomsbury. Simon Warner is the guy who did the book. He's a British, there we have it, right back there. Thank you. Thank you. Now, that's okay. This is my draft, so it might be a little different from what's in the actual book. So this is the original version. This is the original on the road, just kidding. Okay. All right, so here we go. And I will do my best, Janis. Travis, please don't criticize my Janis accent, okay? I'm not from Texas, originally North Carolina. Just like a regular old beatnik on the road. That's how 27-year-old Janis Joplin, at the height of her fame in 1970, described herself to TV's Dick Cavett after she spent a few weeks hitchhiking around northern Brazil with her then beau, David Niehaus. 13 years earlier, in the Gulf Coast town of Port Arthur, Texas, she'd read On the Road and had reimagined her life in the shadow of Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty. Among the children of the 1950s who read Jack Kerouac's On the Road and started their own journeys, many, like Joplin, lived in the most conservative regions of America. In Texas, for example, segregation remained entrenched after civil rights legislation and a Supreme Court ruling. A racist educational system and a repressive moral code kept most young women in their place. Yet, out of this restrictive environment, Janis Joplin emerged as a free-thinking blues fan, soon to become the most emotive white blues singer in rock. Other like-minded young Texans were having similar epiphanies after reading On the Road, including, and some of you guys will recognize these names, Chet Helms, founder of the Family Doll Concerts here in San Francisco at the Avalon Ballroom, and manager of Big Brother and the Holding Company. Travis Rivers, who we're very, very honored to have with us tonight, publisher of underground newspaper The Oracle and proprietor of poster shop The Print Mint and manager of the band Mother Earth. Mother Earth band member Powell St. John, who sadly we just lost a few years ago, with many decades in Berkeley, and was the writer of songs by pioneering psychedelic band The 13th Floor Elevators, as well as Big Brother. And Gilbert Shelton, creator of the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers comics. So some of these names might ring a bell. Together, these Texans formed in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s a loose sort of Texas mafia, prominent members of a scene that they're greatly inspired by a generation earlier, the Beats in North Beach, right here where we are. So, going back to those times, it was Time magazine, interestingly, that originally alerted 14-year-old Janis Joplin to Kerouac and the Beats in the fall of 1957. A bookworm since she could read, she'd become a member of a group of high school malcontents, teenage boys a year older who were all immersed in On the Road. One of them, Jim Langdon, a jazz musician who would become a music critic and journalist, lent Joplin his copy. She devoured it, taking pause at Kerouac's mention of her Golden Triangle region. Here's a little quote from a passage from On the Road. Quote, "We took a chance on one of the dirt roads, and pretty soon we were crossing the evil old Sabine River that is responsible for all these swamps. With amazement, we saw great light ahead of us. Texas, it's Texas! Beaumont, oil town! Huge oil tanks and refineries loom like cities in the oily, fragrant air," end quote. Crammed into the back seat of Langdon's car with the bookish Dave Moriarty and other boys, Joplin cruised the triangle from Port Arthur to neighboring towns Orange and Beaumont. Joplin and her friends found hope on that open road. They too could be Kerouac's, quote, "sordid hipsters of America, a new beat generation, with their real straight talk about souls," end quote. For Joplin, On the Road was, quote, "a revelation," according to Carlene Bennett, her closest girlfriend in high school. Another friend recalled, quote, "we were just book reading, rebellious, and hell raising, and we all eventually wanted to go to North Beach to join the beat generation." And in fact, in her high school, she took on the persona, as she could imagine it, of this beatnik, which of course was her kind's invention, that term, but she started being made fun of and was called this pejorative beat weeds, by the way, by someone. Anyway, among her crowd, Janis was the first to make it here to San Francisco. During 1961, she dropped out of college in that very town of Beaumont that Kerouac referenced and moved to Los Angeles to live with her aunt. But before long, she had left her aunts, relocated to Venice Beach, and started partaking of the beat lifestyle. She was all of 18 years old. She got there just in time for the last gasp of the Gas House, the beat hangout where impoverished poets and artists found a venue for their work since 1959. Locals had demanded it closed there in Venice due to the continual sound of bongos and other such nuisances. The city revoked its permits, so it had become primarily an art gallery with the occasional clandestine performance. Janis would later tell friends that she'd sung there. This name might ring a bell. Eric North, aka Big Daddy, who had run the Gas House in its heyday, was spending much of his time back here in North Beach, where he'd opened the Coexistence Bagel Shop. Venice's most prominent beat poet, Stu Perkoff, who'd sold his Venice West Espresso Cafe, had sadly become addicted to heroin and rarely made the scene anymore. But his cafe, under new ownership, continued to thrive, and Joplin became a regular there. Her new friends encouraged her to start singing and making art, and she started doing more kind of conceptual art when she was there. But several of her pals were junkies who had no qualms about stealing from their friends, including Janis. So, disillusioned, what did she do? She stuck out her thumb and hitchhiked to San Francisco from LA. Again, 18 years old, and she headed straight here to North Beach. She hung around City Lights, bookstore, of course, staying in cheap hotels and sleeping on park benches. Her friend Jim Langdon recalls, quote, "I got a letter from Janis, and I talked a friend into going with me to meet her out in San Francisco. We hitchhiked from Austin. Me and this other guy got a ride to Denver, and we looked at a map of the Union Pacific line, the freight yards there, and decided, well, we could go from Denver up to Wyoming, across the Salt Lake City, but we ended up in the Green River, Wyoming jail, just shy of the Utah line. So that was the end of our adventure." But through Janis, we really identified with the beatniks. This was pre-hippie times. I remember reading a quote Janis gave to somebody, and she said, quote, "I ain't no hippie man, I'm a beatnik." So here, Janis made it. The other guys are stuck back there in Texas, poor things. She did it, right? So here she, quickly started kind of figuring out her way around. She approached a guy named Dave Archer. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that name, but back then he was the doorman of the Fox and Hound Coffee House on Grant Avenue, just around the corner from here. He remembered that Janis asked him in her strong Texas accent if she could sing and sad. In a 2002 memoir, Archer recalled that she was smoking a cigar, wearing a sheepskin and leather vest over a work shirt and blue jeans when she approached him. He'd moved to San Francisco himself as a self-described wanna-beatnik, and he recognized the kindred spirit in Janis. He recalled that he let her in and that she sang Silver Threads and Golden Needles. I don't know if you guys know that song, it's a classic, that very night. But soon after, Janis ran out of money, and she had a little bit of cash left, enough to take a bus back home to Port Arthur. So that was her first venture here, in 1961. The next year, at 62, Janis enrolled at the University of Texas in Austin after a visit to a place called the Ghetto, which was a decrepit off-campus apartment building filled with bohemians. A resident there, Powell St. John, who I mentioned before, was an art student and harmonica player from West Texas. Quote, "When I moved into the ghetto, my apartment had just been vacated by a beatnik," St. John recalls. When I came to the university in 1959, I fancied myself a beatnik. He would soon invite Janis to join his acoustic folk bluegrass group, the Waller Creek Boys. With this trio, she'd sing blues and folk tunes in public for the first time. They're in Austin. Through their frequent appearances on campus and the beer joint Threadgills, Joplin met Chet Helms, who thought of himself as, quote, a beatnik on the road. A year older than Joplin, his youth in Fort Worth, Texas. His mother's family were fundamentalist Baptists, so his strict upbringing included no dancing and no dating, he told me. In 1960, he entered the University of Texas as a member of the ROTC and the Young Republicans. See, people can't change. He soon became a civil rights activist, though, and joined the left-leaning progressive group Students for Direct Action, which worked to integrate the city of Austin's movie theaters and lunch counters. He himself had experienced racism in Fort Worth when epithets were hurled at his Asian stepfather. A voracious reader, Helms became a regular at the ghetto, discovered peyote and pot, and made friends with a bisexual black student who turned him on to Ornette Coleman and other cool jazz players. Helms recalled, quote, at the University of Texas, I had been with a crowd of bohemian fringe people who lived at the ghetto. We had red wine parties and peyote tea parties. These people were referred to by everybody else at the university as beatniks, and so we also identified as beatniks. And we read the literature, we read On the Road, and we had to hitchhike to California. Part of earning your stripes as a beatnik was hitchhiking from coast to coast several times, end quote. So, of course, what does he do? He quits UT in the spring of '62 and began traveling like his hero, Jack Kerouac. Quote, I came to California for a few months. I was very enamored of the beat generation here in San Francisco, which was the mecca for the beats. I could not get there fast enough. But then I went back to Austin, hooked up with Janis again, and started talking about the West Coast, and she shared a lot about her experiences living in Venice in 1961. Janis was very well read in the beat literature, as was I, and she was very attracted to San Francisco for that reason, of course. That's where Lawrence Ferlinghetti and all those folks were, end quote. So in January 1963, right after her 20th birthday, Janis quit UT too and joined Helms on the road, hitching together here to San Francisco. Quote, when I think about Janis, I think about what it was like to grow up in Texas in the 50s, Helms once reflected. And I think about a couple of lines from a couple of her songs. One of them is, why is it breathing in the air? That's a song called Ego Rock. Because that's what it was like living in Texas. It's hard to convey, and I don't think it was just Texas. I think it was America of the Eisenhower years, Helms went on to say. Texas was an extreme example of it. I've always thought that the reason why extraordinary singers, writers, performers, musicians, and so on came out of Texas was because it was such a repressive environment. And the only space you had was what you created for yourself with your imagination. That paid off in manifold ways in terms of artistic expression. The other line I always think about, he said, is from another Texan that we just lost, Chris Christopherson's song, Me and Bobby McGee. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. We all know that line, right? That's in many ways the way we felt back then, said Chet, and I think the way Janis felt in Texas at the same time. Well, once they got here in San Francisco, Joplin and Helms crashed at a friend's apartment in a rundown neighborhood. If we could have afforded it, we'd have stayed in North Beach, Helms recalled. You guys might relate to this one. But because of all that publicity of the beat area, the rents had gone sky high in North Beach. So we were forced out to Haight-Ashbury, which was a cheap rent district. Things change, right? Joplin spent much of her time hanging out in North Beach coffee houses, though. The Fox and Hound had become Coffee and Confusion, where Joplin soon became a regular. Co-editor with poet Bob Kaufman, who's featured right over here, was still hanging out in the neighborhood. Joplin ran into him in a bar one night where he was flying on speed and rapping to anyone who would listen. She listened carefully. In addition to playing the coffee gallery for a few dollars, Janis joined panhandlers at the corner, right down here, of Grant and Green, singing for spare change and taking a cue from outside city lights with sandwich boards offering poems in exchange for donation. Janis had started writing some poetry herself and also some song lyrics to songs like "You Can Drink and Do" and "So Sad to Be Alone." Next door, a few beats and musicians still gathered at Vesuvio, and she would visit these landmarks during her earlier trip to San Francisco, but this time she felt like she actually belonged. A few doors up the street from Coffee and Confusion, the Coffee Gallery at 1353 Grant was a larger club that had hosted readings by Ferlinghetti, Kaufman, and others in 1959. Though Joplin was still underage, she wasn't 21 yet, she managed to get into the place with the help of friendly bartender Howard Hessman, a member of the improv comedy troupe, The Committee. You guys might know that name. She wowed the owners on Hoot Night and booked a gig there as well. 4 years after its heyday, the Coffee Gallery and other North Beach haunts were frequented by tourists as much as folk music fans and bohemians. Although I did find this really cool flyer for a benefit show that Janis did there, sharing a bill with Lou Welch. You guys probably know that name, beat poet and friend of Kerouac, etc. I think for some reason the gig was canceled, and I could never figure out why it was canceled, so who knows? I would imagine. So let's see, where was it? Okay, so Joplin was in and out. That began her first, love affair with San Francisco, really. So she was in and out of town here from 1963 to 65. She would set out, hitchhiking around. She got a little car, drove out of town, went down to LA, and finally ended up in New York City's East Village, where I used to live. And while she was there, she checked out some of the Beats' old haunts in the West Village. Unfortunately, along the way, she did pick up a very nasty drug habit, shooting methamphetamine. And that addiction nearly killed her back then in 1965. By the time she boarded a bus back home to Port Arthur again, she weighed less than 90 pounds. But she got back to Texas, cleaned up, got healthy, went back to school, kept writing songs, and started singing and performing again around Texas, around Beaumont, and also in Austin. Finally, about a year later, 1966, Janis was beckoned again to San Francisco by Chet Helms, who we heard about before, who'd started organizing psychedelic concerts with the loose-knit family dog and managing Big Brother and the Holding Company. The improvisational Big Brother wanted a female lead singer, and in June of 1966, Joplin joined their mutual friend, Travis Rivers, who's here with us tonight, on a road trip west. I can tell you some good stories about that trip, I can tell you. Travis had run an antiquarian bookshop in Austin called the Travis Bookshop, and between attending classes at UT and partaking in peyote, he was a big reader and book collector. Drawn to the beats, books, and the blues, Travis and Joplin had an on-again, off-again relationship, but it fizzled after a few weeks back here in the Haight. Rivers went on to become the publisher of the underground newspaper, The Oracle. The paper's operation was in a back room of the Print Mint, a shop Rivers opened to sell posters to Kelly and Rick Griffin. And Travis Rivers also would put together the roots rock band Mother Earth, which featured Powell St. John, who I mentioned, who had relocated also to San Francisco, and the great vocalist Tracy Nelson, who thank God we still have, who's living down in Tennessee and still singing amazingly. Powell St. John's song, Bye Bye Baby, for you Janis fans, you might recognize that became one of the first songs that Janis brought to the Big Brother repertoire when she joined the group. And she just learned that from Powell before she left Austin in '66 to come here to San Francisco. So now, here she was, lead singer of the Big Brother and the Holding Company, although in the beginning was much more of a democracy. She didn't even sing all the songs. They were split up between the other guys in the band. But she did find her tribe immediately when she got here in 1966, June of '66. The band members, bassist Peter Albin, drummer Dave Getz, who are playing a gig tonight, or else they would be here. I love them. And guitarists James Gurley and Sam Andrew, sadly no longer with us, had all of them been aficionados of Kerouac. Before Janis joined the band, Big Brother and the Holding Company had played San Francisco's Second Trips Festival with Neil Cassidy, Ken Kesey, and the Merry Pranksters as ringleaders. And light shows were created there and later projected at Chet Helms' Avalon Ballroom by another Southerner named Bill Ham, an artist and jazz fan who'd moved to San Francisco in 1960. Big Brother's Dave Getz relocated here from New York in 1960 and moved right here to North Beach to study art. Inspired by Kerouac and jazz musicians, Getz recalled that, quote, "North Beach was my scene. San Francisco was just the best in the early 60s. I'd get off work at the Spaghetti Factory and walk down Broadway and go to the Jazz Workshop and hear John Coltrane, Max Roach, and Art Blakey. In 1965, Getz lived on Fillmore Street next door to artists Jay DeFeo and Wally Hedrick, who threw parties where the remaining beats gathered. Sam Andrew, guitarist, who was raised in far-flung places due to his father's career in the Air Force, had been studying linguistics and English literature at Berkeley before joining Big Brother. Sam always disparaged the term hippie as being a derogatory label given to those who traveled to San Francisco in search of the beat forebears. Rather than being hip like the Beats, they were hippies. He hated that. When Joplin arrived at the Haight in June 1966 to rehearse with Big Brother, she and the band immediately hit it off. She embraced their loud improvisational music and songs like Peter Alvin's Light is Faster Than Sound, though she had never ever performed with an electric band at that point. Quote, "When I first met Janis, she was not a stranger to me at all," Sam Andrew remembered. "We talked for hours and hours into the night, every night in the universe." You know, heavy things, right? The band's other guitarist, James Gurley, whose avant-garde style was inspired by John Coltrane, had moved from Detroit to the West Coast in the early 60s. Quote, "There's something mysterious about San Francisco, an air, a spirit of something you just don't feel in any other city," Gurley once explained. "Jack Kerouac had a lot to do with it. I've been reading On the Road and the Dharma Bums and all of his novels, so that was an inspiration for me to go to California, San Francisco especially, from reading his novels." Gurley and Joplin briefly became a couple after she joined the band, but similar to relationships detailed in Kerouac's work, it did not last, and Gurley returned to his wife, Nancy. After she left Big Brother in 1968, though, the bonds were not broken. She retained a close friendship with Andrews and Gurley and the other guys in the band. By the late 60s, other Texans from Austin's ghetto scene arrived in San Francisco. In addition to the aforementioned Powell St. John, there was the artist Gilbert Shelton, who was from Houston, and he had made his name in Texas via his work as editor of the UT humor magazine, The Ranger, and primarily through his subversive comics. In 1968, he moved to San Francisco, and here he created the counterculture's iconic Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. As for Janis, she clung to her identity as the progeny of the Beats, which sustained her from her dismal existence in her home state. Quote, "In Texas, I was a beatnik, a weirdo," she told critic Nat Hintoff in 1968. "Texas is okay if you want to settle down and do your own thing quietly, but it's not for outrageous people, and I was always outrageous. I got treated very badly in Texas." Hintoff noted her grim smile when she said these words. Quote, "They don't treat beatniks too good in Texas." Quote. Joplin's success as a singer meant constant touring. To the end of her life, she would stay on the road. Taking a break in February 1970, she flew to Brazil for Carnival. There she met Ohio, who himself had been traveling through South America for a year and a half. Harkening back to those days hitchhiking from Texas to California, Janis joined Niehaus on his adventure. Quote, "Most people in her position at that point would not be on the highway in Brazil hitchhiking into the jungle," says Niehaus. I mean, think about it. Can you guys imagine Lady Gaga or, anybody else hitchhiking at the top of their fame, right? Taylor Swift, maybe? I don't think so. Okay, so Niehaus recalled, quote, to go up there with her position in the world, to be already so successful, that's a real unusual person. When we were on the road together, she had compassion for people. There's nobody I've ever met that has had as much compassion as Janis did, end quote. After their month together in Brazil, Niehaus would spend time in this area in Marin County with Joplin before continuing his own journey, taking him around the world. Following his departure, Janis would sometimes name check his quest when she sang her song Cry Baby. You know, when she sang the song Cry Baby, you know, there's that whole great rap where she's like, you're off in Kathmandu and you could be home in my silk sheets, and you know. So anyway, so that was referencing Niehaus, who's a great guy. Still living in Hawaii now. So, as we all know, sadly, we just passed the anniversary. Janis's journey ended in October 1970, when she died from an accidental overdose of heroin. 6 weeks earlier, she had returned to Texas for her high school reunion. While she was there, she was, bombarded, and they asked her about her outsider status growing up in Port Arthur, and she told them, quote, I felt apart from them, nearly breaking into tears. Just couldn't be like them. And David Niehaus told me, yes, she was so very, very sensitive to the world, and that's what killed her. She just had to turn it off. So that's my story about Janis and coming to San Francisco. And again, as I mentioned, there are so many similarities in a lot of ways between just the type of people they were, Janis and Kerouac, and I think compassion, that's one of the, the key words that I heard mentioned about Janis a lot, and of course, those of you who have read Kerouac know that comes up a lot in his writing, and certainly was part of who he was, and as a writer, what he tried to convey in his writing. Of course, the whole San Francisco thing, they both kind of found themselves here in San Francisco. Later, Kerouac, of course, would have kind of a, love-hate relationship, but that was mainly, I think, due to some of the changes he had gone through in his life, and sadly, his alcoholism. And Janis, I think, even though it was heroin that killed her, she was definitely, I think, her main addiction was to alcohol. And so, there's that kind of similarity between the two of them as well. Although I think Janis always found San Francisco as a balm for her. She traveled and toured so extensively, and it was exhausting. I mean, just night after night after night on these shows. And just, as you guys have probably seen clips of her on stage, she never ever dialed it in. She totally put herself out here. So when she was, especially when she had her house out in Larkspur, but even before that, when they were, still living on the Haight and et cetera, she, just loved it here so much, and not just the people and finding, people that embraced her as who she was, but also just the nature and the beauty, et cetera, of this area just really affected her so much. And I think, again, too, with Kerouac, sadly, I just was at Big Sur, and when you see the beauty of that place and the way his head had changed around when he wrote the book Big Sur, and how something about all the nature and beauty actually became ominous to him, frightening to him. It's, again, I think it shows kind of some of the changes that he was going through, and a lot of it had to do with fame and media. You guys probably know how horribly he was treated by not only just critics, literary critics, etc., but he was just turned into the king of the beats and the beatnik, and just kind of bombarded by this image that had been created of him in the media. And in a way, the same kind of thing happened to Janis as well. I mean, she, like Kerouac, was, just became this magnet for the media, and she was so charismatic, and she had a great way with quips, etc., that, the attention and the focus was. But at the same time, just like there was this horrible backlash against Kerouac, and when you read some of the reviews of his books, it's just heartbreaking, stabbing how nasty some of these critics were about his work, and some of it seemed to have a personal kind of vendetta quality, jealousy or something. Same thing with Janis, although being a woman, believe me, she was, the way she was described in media, you would never hear these kind of descriptions of like Jim Morrison or Mick Jagger or something like that, describing her physical presence or her complexion. I mean, reading some of those reviews were just horrifying. And even though she was kind of became the poster child here in the Bay Area for Rolling Stone, which of course was created here in 1967, November of '67, first issue, and they loved Big Brother and the Holding Company, but when Janis dared to leave the band and go out on her own, she was ripped to shreds by a lot of the writers for that magazine. And in fact, just talking about it earlier with Joey, that she, when she started playing with her second band that she put together after Big Brother, she was put on the cover of Rolling Stone, and it said, Janis, the Judy Garland of rock? Question mark, and then horribly, Judy died 6 weeks after that cover, and much was made of Janis' fragility and how she couldn't handle it, and her new band sucked, and even the great Ralph Gleason, who was a huge champion of Janis here. Oh my God, you guys would not believe the stuff he wrote. Like when they came back here late, soon after she put this new band together later called the Cosmic Blues Band. Anyway, she did a show here, they were still putting the band together, and instead of, giving her any sort of like leeway, like she's got this new band, he's like, this band was horrible, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of, she should quit this band and go crawling back to Big Brother. But, that kind of mean-spirited treatment by, smart people, same thing happened to Kerouac. So I think having to deal with some of this, Kerouac had his, his Johnny Walker Black and all his sundry, kept trying new kinds of booze to try, but it's horrible. And same thing with Janis, with her, trying to dull that pain. And actually, that's when she became addicted to heroin, was during that period in 1969 when she was, put the band together, being the, band leader, doing all kinds of new types of material and things like that, and just the pressure was just so horrible for her. So anyway, as I'm doing my work as a researcher now, trying to understand Kerouac and his life and how he created this wonderful work that has stood the test of time, I can't help but sometimes think about Janis and how, same thing with her, this amazing music that she left us. She was able to persevere and do it. She kept writing songs, and both of them, I just wish we could have held on to them much longer to see how they could have turned a corner, if Jack could have turned a corner. And I'm looking into all kinds of research now that has been conducted just recently, like every few months there's a new study that's come out about the effects of traumatic head injury, several of which Kerouac sustained over many years in his life. And of course, as a young boy, young man, he got out of Lowell, Massachusetts on a football scholarship to Columbia. And back those days, believe me, the helmets were practically nothing, right? So, and he writes about some head injuries that he had and the effect on him and his memory, etc. So anyway, I'm just crawling along myself now, trying to understand him, his life, and I look forward, hopefully, to come back here in, maybe a couple of years to do a talk about my Jack Kerouac biography. Right now it's called Jack Kerouac, An Artist's Life. You never know with books if that title might change, but that's what I'm here working on, and I would love to take any questions. I'll do my best to answer them. If I can't answer them, maybe somebody else out there will be able to answer them. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Okay, I saw the gentleman in the red shirt first, so.
One of the things that I noticed when I've seen clips of Janis with her band is that she's often commented that she's dancing and stuff, but I think people have noticed she's conducting the band. And people tell me she's not conducting the band, she's dancing. And I said, well, you look at the band member's eyes, they're watching her feet and her gestures and things like that, and they say, well, they're probably just staring at her ass. Now, what I don't get is why isn't there more emphasis on Janis's intelligence?
Yeah.
She's a very bright woman.
Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, actually, what inspired me to want to write the Janis biography was the fact that, some people have the feel, some of them have the technique, and Janis had both. And what I discovered was I got a gig writing liner notes for a box set called the Pearl Sessions. So Columbia had in their vaults, owned by Sony, all these alternate takes from the making of the album Pearl, her posthumously released Pearl album. And they gave me the opportunity to listen to all the stuff and also chit-chat between her and the producer, Paul Rothchild. Now, when they went into the studio in the fall of 1970 to work on this record, even like people like Jim Morrison, to mention him again, but they were completely told what to do in the studio by the producer. And you can hear stuff like Paul Rothchild, who produced The Doors, for example, and would make Morrison do like 18 takes or whatever on a song. Here I hear this guy, Paul Rothchild, who was like a hard-driving, producer, worked with all the blues guys out of Chicago, etc. He's going like, oh, Janis was coming up with these ideas in the studio, like guitar parts, arrangements, different tempos to try different songs. She was calling the shots in the studio, and this was a time when, nobody hardly got to do stuff like this. And here was a woman doing it, and here was a woman that was so in command of her talent and her, acumen in the studio that, Paul Rothchild was like, yeah, Janis, that's a great idea. He sounds like a little kid, like, yeah, that's a great idea. That's great. I love that, So I'm like, wow, there's this whole other Janis Joplin that, because I bought, the stories that the media had told me, reading about her in Rolling Stone in the 70s and reading some of the other biographies where she is painted very much as a victim who couldn't handle fame, she had issues with it, but she was still, it didn't take away from her power and her strength and her ambition. She also would try to downplay her ambition, and also she would downplay her intellect, which was huge. The woman was, as I mentioned in my little piece I read, she was such a bookworm. The great Linda Gravenites, who made her little beaded book bag, it was big enough to carry a bottle of booze and a hardcover book. And she read all the time. I was almost going to do a little, what do you call it, appendix in the back of the book listing some of Janis' favorite books, because I got to go through her stuff and books that she left behind that the family has, and then she would write letters and, talk about books that she was reading and things like that. So, yeah, and she definitely led the band. I got to, when she started with Big Brother and the Holding Company, she was the newbie. Wait, hold on. Right here. So she, pretty much, it was a democracy, but she gradually started gaining power in that band, which did cause the problems. In addition to her wanting to spread out and do all kinds of different music, and Big Brother had their thing going, which was very cool, but there was a lot of other stuff she wanted to do that they weren't into doing. But also there was a bit of a power struggle as well. And when she started her next band, she definitely was that band leader. And the same thing with, by the time she had Full Tilt Boogie, her last band, though she had really learned to be a band leader, because it's not easy just to switch from a democracy in a band to being the band leader, especially with a lot of seasoned players that she had. And it was a biracial band too, by the way, which is really, again, it's something that was not that common in that time in 1969. So by the time she had the Full Tilt Boogie, she was totally in control, but it was like a really great relationship with her and the band. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That yeah, she danced around, but she was also in control, and she was really into improvisation. Again, another Kerouacian kind of artistic element that Janis and Big Brother were into, and then that was part of her, performing with her other bands as well. So thanks for that. Okay, some other, yes?
So if I was going to be writing a biography of Kerouac, I think I would want to be familiar with the already published biographies, but I would want to come at Kerouac with what some people call beginners. So it's new and it's fresh, so when readers come to it, they say, oh, this is really an original and different take on the man. Is that some of what you're thinking at all? Is that...
Well, I'm hoping, you know, I have been reading all the other books, and, you know, there are various levels of, you know, access people had to certain, you know, people that were alive that they got to interview, which sadly I don't have the luxury of having. But then some of them, there were certain, you know, personal writings and papers and things like that that sadly people did not have access to, which I'm very fortunate to have. And then also just with technology being what it is to, you know, help give me, you know, lots and lots of access to stuff like that. But I think, you know, what I hope to bring to it in addition to that is I'm trying to explore some areas that, you know, for example, one of my favorite books is the one that Joyce Johnson wrote. Word is all, God, my brain's starting to Voice is all, not the word is all, the voice is all. Thank you, Charlie. I love that book, and she goes into a lot of depth on his French-Canadian heritage, his background, and how it affected him growing up in Lowell, as, you know, really feeling as an outsider. He didn't speak English till he was around 6. He, throughout his writings, wrote in French and thought in French, and he actually had, I think, guilt about not writing more in French, and really tried to explore his French Canadian heritage, and then even going all the way back to Brittany, where his ancestors came from. So I hope to delve a lot into that area of Kerouac, the effect on him throughout his whole life, not just in his early years or whatever, but how that affected his writing up until the end of his life. And then other things that I'm trying to look into, again, just this medical research that's been done about head injury, and looking like, you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I can't by any means like label him or anything like that, but I can present information and people can kind of make their own decisions about things like that. And then also I just hope to, I try to do this with all of my biographies because I grew up loving biographies. I read them more than I read novels, and for me, reading about a subject that I find really interesting, I really like to, you know, it's like reading a novel, you know, to read about someone's life, especially someone whose work that I found to be very influential and innovative, and somehow even not only to reflect the world they were living in, but to also kind of predict or be prescient about things that are going to be changing in the world. And so all of my subjects have felt, you know, I feel like they filled that role, and so of course, obviously Kerouac has. So that's another part that I like to try to influence, like, you know, just the work and the life and how they intertwine, but write that in a way enthralls people like yourself who've read all the other biographies and read all the work and, you know, have read a lot, to still make people, you know, help people think about him in other ways, or to maybe learn something new, but be entertained by the story. And then also be able to reach younger readers who don't know that much. Maybe you've heard of On the Road, maybe saw the movie or something like that, but to help them kind of contextualize who he was and his life and work. So that's my goal. Whether I can pull it off, you guys, please send me good vibes. It's not easy, it sucks, I hate writing. I love researching, I hate writing.
Well, just having the word artist in the title makes a big difference.
Oh, good, thank you. Joey?
Yeah, obviously, a very striking parallel between their two lives is their sexuality and their bisexuality. And Janis, you know, definitely had, you know, girlfriends, relationships, but she played it down because she was afraid that could destroy her
to an
career.
extent. I mean, when you read the book, I mean, you just got it, thank you. I mean, with her relationship with Jay Whitaker, who sadly we just lost, who was this wonderful woman that I got to spend time with here. She was an African-American woman, originally from the South, who had to put up with so much racism, and she was queer, and she and Janis found each other and lived together here in San Francisco. And Janis, you know, this was in that period from 63 to 65. Yeah, and Janis was very, and even back in Port Arthur, I mean, you guys, it was illegal back then, and of course it was during Kerouac's day, and he was worried about being, haven't found out it yet about, he thought he was under surveillance, and was going to be arrested for being queer or hanging out with queers and blah, blah, all this kind of stuff. And, looking into trying to get the FBI files and, because, yeah.
That's what I'm kind of interested
Yeah,
in, is
so.
like, I mean, Janis, it's pretty much come out. I mean, it's not that she hid it, but from the publicity, she was terrified if it got out as a publicity thing. In her personal life,
Yeah.
I think she was pretty loose. And Kerouac's
Yeah.
whole, I mean, exploring the relationship between his bisexuality and what he wrote, or how he felt, or how it affected him.
Yeah, and I mean, Kerouac is just so complicated. Those of you guys who have read other biographies or know, just with his very Catholic upbringing, etc. His mother, his father, who was, very bigoted, and were very homophobic, and he had a lot of pressure. But look at all who his best friends were. And he did have sex with men. He didn't brag about having getting a blowjob from Gore Vidal or giving him one. I'm not sure exactly what happened. I'm not going to go there. Just saying. But he kind of covered that up a little bit in the Subterraneans. But kind of hints at it a little bit. So so it's very complicated. And again, you have to understand that I think now what's really exciting about the times we live in, and hopefully we are going to be protected to be able to seek, love in whatever shape, form that we desire. Of course, we have scary things around us now, but still, as far as people like my son's age, who's 26, and his friends and high school kids even, just how fluid sexuality and gender can be, and I think always has been, and it's just a matter now of being able to freely express with that fluidity, yourself. And both of them, I think, in their own way, on their writing and the freedom of their writing and the freedom of the way they live their lives, kind of express that, even though they did have some complexities there that complicated some of the matters. And sometimes it's stabbing to read some of the negative things that Kerouac does say about queer culture and, some of his best friends, who were queer. So you just have to kind of try to figure out, how to deal with that. And that's going to be tricky, I think. So,
Good luck.
Thanks. Yes.
So, you said you were contacted by the Sampas estate, and I think Gerald Nicosia has said some very controversial things about them and how they're trying to frame the narrative and prevent access to records and selling off a lot of items. Can you speak to that? How is that affecting your work? What's the environment there?
Well, I'm very fortunate that I'm dealing with Jim Sampas, who's, incredible person, who has kind of blazed his own trail as far as representing the estate. Previously, another family member did that, who since, passed away. And so I think just the way things change in Washington, fortunately things have changed for us writers and researchers, and Charlie can, testify to this, that there is an incredible, open arms policy as far as access to materials, and they have been nothing but, helpful to me. I mean, and I'm keeping my focus, on, an artist's life. So I'm not going to go in, I know there's been a lot of difficult things that happened after Kerouac's death, after his mother, his mother's death, his wife's, etc. But luckily for me, that's not part of my purview. I mean, I'm sure some other writer someday may want to cover the whole, and I've heard of researchers that are doing kind of, the reverberations of everything post, Kerouac, the living man, or even, with his estate or whatever. There may be, further research and writing about that, but it's not going to really be my purview. So, I feel very fortunate. So. Timing is everything. Yes.
Yes, well, as I told you before, we are with a group came from Argentina to a sort of literary tour in California. This is our closing night, so it couldn't be better.
Oh my God, I'm so honored. Thank you. Let's give it up for these guys from Argentina, these men and women that are here. We welcome them.
So I have a question. What can you tell us about the opinion, or maybe the feelings that Kerouac had about the younger generation, hippies and summer of love?
Well, again, tragically, just like, how could he write so negatively about the beauty of Big Sur? You can understand there was a lot going on in his head. And so, sadly, as the counterculture bloomed and blossomed and people loved Kerouac, Janis and Big Brother and everybody, so respect, and Ken Kesey, of course. Sadly, he was, kind of feeling, I think again, almost in a way that, he said, he wrote a very widely read essay about this not too long before he died. I'm blanking on the correct title of it, something like what I've, you guys probably have heard about it. But anyway, I think he really felt that they were had taken some of his ideas too far, and he apparently was not a big fan of psychedelics, for example, although there is an amazing notebook that I've looked at, Charlie I think has seen it too, where Timothy Leary gave him some LSD and then had told him to write in this notebook, all the ideas and thoughts and visions that were coming through, etc. And sadly didn't have too much to it. But I think he did become kind of a reactionary as far as, the new generation, and part of it too, again, going back to right after On the Road became this huge media event, and he was bombarded by young people in the beginning who were, knocking on his door, and in the beginning he kind of welcomed them in and would drink with them and smoke weed with them and all that kind of stuff. But I think he started feeling almost like kind of like tokenized, or that they weren't really reading his work, they more were seeing him as a symbol. And perhaps he felt the same way. Maybe if he read my essay and saw how, these guys who actually read the work, perhaps he would have been more receptive to some of their lifestyle and new ideas. But at the time, he was kind of sadly reverting back. I mean, he almost seemed kind of like his dad, Leo Kerouac, who was, like I said, very conservative and bigoted. But again, I'm hoping to understand maybe more through, his physical health at the time, as far as I can, not being a psychiatrist or a medical doctor, so I can only see what he said and did. But it's very sad. It's kind of, and others have been, John Dos Passos, is another one who was this incredible, progressive writer and idea, philosopher, idea person who turned very conservative later in life as well. So, yeah. Kind of what happened. But I will say, later on in life, there are these amazing things that I've read, Charlie, you've probably seen them too, letters and lists of poets that should definitely be included in an anthology of beat poetry. And he was very much, be sure you must include, and wrote down some different women poets. And then from the women that I have, I've gotten to interview a few women friends of his, including Joyce Johnson, and for the most part, they've told me that he was very supportive and encouraging, especially Joyce, for breaking free of that kind of 50s mentality of the little white picket fence and home, which also was something that dogged Janis as well. That was so ingrained in the psyche in those days, but he was really encouraging, Joyce to go off and write her novels and be a writer, etc., and be a free thinker. So, again, a very complicated person. And also, sadly, he was a terrible, but he did encourage his daughter, very few times that they communicated, he did encourage his daughter Jan, who was quite a great writer, to go to Mexico, to hitchhike, to and to write. And
She went to South America.
yeah, so yes, exactly. And I fortunately it's so weird how life takes you on these journeys. Way before I ever even imagined writing this book, I got to meet Jan and hang out with her. She was up in Woodstock, New York, where I live now, and that area. She was incredibly cool. And it turns out she spent a lot of time in that area, and we have all these mutual friends and stuff, so it's pretty cool. I wish I could have known her longer. Another question? I guess we're getting, let's see, does anybody else have a question or anything? Well, I just want to again thank everybody for coming out on this Sunday night, and I would love to, if you want to pick up a book, all the money goes to the Beat Museum, so except for their expenses, of course. So I encourage you guys to, you know, you don't have to buy my book, but anything you want to buy here, they have really cool stuff, and I'm so glad to see you guys all and gals and everybody all out here, and I'm happy to sign any of my books if you do want to buy any of them. So thank you again so much.
Thank you, Holly. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Jerry.
Folks, I'm just going to take a moment. As Holly mentioned, her books are here. We have a number of them. And I have something I wanted to give you. We were talking earlier about an event that took place. And I wanted to give you some posters that were just sent to us. This is the 1994 event that took place at NYU. This was actually the first big beat event I ever attended, and I loved it. And so this is some of these were sent to us by the English professor that actually put this on. So he sent us a bunch of them. So I'd like to give you this one, and we can ship it to you if you like. And then this one is special as well. You were talking about Jack as an artist, and this is Jack's painting kit that was featured at this 1994 event. So I actually remember that quite clearly. I took photographs of it myself. And we have a few of these. If anybody wants to buy any, we have a couple of them left. So feel free to take this. Thanks for coming.
He learned to paint from a woman. Well, a guy helped him too, but one of the main influences was this woman who I've become obsessed with named Dodie Mueller, who he was introduced to by Mary and Robert Frank. And they had a thing for a couple months, but I wish it would have gone longer. But anyway, in their correspondence, which I've gotten to read, is just incredible. Again, they're both kind of supporting, she's supporting him about trying to get through his head, you know, the complexities of dealing with life through painting, which he really ended up doing and drawing and stuff to the end of his life. And then, you know, he was encouraging her in her endeavors. You know, she was this cool woman who had a loft as a painter. She was actually from Texas too, I just realized, wow. And her husband, who was a painter, died in I think it was a motorcycle crash. And then after that, she was on her own, got her own loft, was a painting studio, and so that's how Kerouac really got into that painting world, I think. She was the main influence on him. So.
Over there, I think, with David Amber.
Oh yeah, there is a great picture of her and David, yes.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.